I am very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dan Freidus, who I have to say has traveled all the way from the University of Michigan, where he holds a day job, to be here with us tonight. He's a passionate collector and researcher specializing in early American paper money and economic history, and has given presentations at the American Numismatic Society in New York and the Colonial Coin Collectors Club in Boston. For 10 years, he wrote the Colonial Americana column of Coin World, and he's the author of The History and Die Variety of the Haven Copper. His work as a consultant to collectors, dealers, and museums includes being a guest curator on a team that created an exhibition that's been at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for the past 5 years. It's called Drachmas, Doubloons, and Dollars, The History of Money. Tonight, Dan will share his considerable expertise on money in the 18th century in his presentation From Wampum to the U.S. Mint. And we hope that you'll be able to stay afterwards. We will uncover the refreshments on the refreshment table, and you'll have a chance to, talk among yourselves and also to talk more to Dan and look at the coins that are in the case in the back of the room. So, take it away, Dan.
And I'd be glad to take questions, so feel free to interrupt or raise your hand as I'm talking. And I have some pictures that I'll show of some of the things I'm talking about at the end. And besides some of the coins from the Society's collection being in the case, I've also brought a selection of financial documents and paper money in the 18th century that's also in that case, and you'll hear about some of them first. The 18th century, really, things changed a lot. When we look at the 17th century and money in America or Connecticut, New England, wherever you want to look at it, things are really crude. They don't resemble the economic system that we're used to today. Barter was more important. Buying on credit was even more important without plastic. Whether that meant running a tab at the local merchant or writing a note saying, I owe you such and such because I just got a cow from you or whatever. Wampum, in the title of the talk, really was an important part of 17th century economy, especially in New York, in New England, and a little bit in some colonies further south. And wampum was basically clam shells, occasionally some other shells, cut into beads. And for a variety of reasons, Native Americans valued purple ones more than white. Now part of that is, especially around here, if you look at quahog shells, the purple part is much smaller, tends to be harder, and harder to work with. And so bead made of that part of the shell took more work, and there was less raw material to find. Of course, when Europeans came into the picture, they introduced counterfeiting. It might be take a piece of wood and try to dye it purple. And there are many stories, it's hard to know whether they're apocryphal or true, that counterfeit wampum tended to work on Europeans, but the Native Americans could figure out what a shell looked like. And I'm not sure whether the part to doubt is that there were people who couldn't figure out the difference between a shell and a piece of wood, or that the difference between Native Americans and Europeans was that dramatic. Who knows? But for a variety of reasons, wampum wasn't perfect. Definitely wasn't perfect if you wanted to do a large transaction. Also, how big does that beads be? What if someone gave you slightly undersized beads? Should they be 10% discount or something? And so it was a complicated system. Commodities got used as money. In the South, tobacco was commonly used for that. In fact, one of the first effective forms of paper money was receipts for tobacco. So the receipt might be, I've got 100 pounds of tobacco in my barn, and it now belongs to you. And that receipt might trade. It's sort of like money backed by gold, but money backed by tobacco. But the question was, if you were going to then spend that as a piece of paper money, what if you spent it with someone who didn't know so-and-so, whose barn was named on that? What if so-and-so decided, I'm going to take that 100-pound package and make it down to about 80? And by the time someone ever calls and tries to get the tobacco, it's 12 people removed from the person who originally deposited it. And so if it's not 100 pounds, who do you blame? So that worked, but it wasn't perfect. In New England, tobacco was not a significantly important part of the economy in that way. Massachusetts came up with a solution which was paper money more like what we know as paper money. Government printing something and saying, this is worth such and such an amount. That was in 1690. It was basically a promise by the colonial state government. And this was a novelty, at least a novelty in Western society. There had been experiments in China at various times, but they didn't really influence the West's use of paper money. The things that we might recognize as money that existed in the 17th century but weren't as common as most people would have liked was largely silver coins from the Spanish Empire. In the 1500s, in Potosi, in what's now Bolivia, Europeans took over a large Incan silver mine. And when I say large, this mine produced immense amounts of silver. Then Mexico City, a few decades later, and there was a period of about 200 years where the majority of silver that came out of the ground in the world came from South and Central America. And the majority of that was controlled by the Spanish in one way or another. And so that money ended up being used here. England didn't have much silver to speak of, and so they were not supplying the colonies with silver. In fact, even if they had it, there's good reasons to think, given the way they did treat the colonies, that this was the last place they would have sent silver. They might demand silver if someone was buying something from England, but they sure aren't going to send it here to buy something from us. And the Mexican, or the Spanish dollar really influenced our economic system and our currency down to the current day. 8 reals, it wasn't called the Spanish dollar officially, although that's the way it was referred to in lots of financial documents in America and in parts of Europe. But the denomination on the coin, and its official denomination, was 8 reals. Or 8 bits was another way it was referred to. So 2 bits was a quarter, and there are still people who think of a quarter as being 2 bits. And as recently as the early 20th century, there are tokens from stores where they might have given you change and used it for advertising, where the tokens are 12.5-cent tokens. Not so much in New England, but I know as late as 1910, 1915, I've seen tokens from Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado that were issued in not only 12.5 cents, but even 6.25-cent tokens. Whenever I see those, I'm really thankful for the decimal system. Not that the British system was any better. 12 pence made a shilling, 20 shillings made a pound. And of course there were farthings, so it was 480 farthings to the pound. And this is only talking about copper and silver. If you had gold into it, gold wasn't even a nice, even multiple of the silver system. And so accounting in the British colonies was done in British currency, so pound sterling. But if you did a transaction, you never actually had coins that were denominated in pound sterling. So basic math wasn't really basic. Things as simple as dividing by 2 or multiplying by 3 turned out to be fairly complex if you're dealing with something where the price was 1 pound, 2 shillings, and 7 pence. Especially if you then had to pay for it in things denominated in 8s. Um, although the 17th century really is about commodity money and accounting, there were a couple of attempts to provide coins. After the Revolution in England, in 1652, Massachusetts got permission to issue their own coins. What we know as pine tree shillings, but is the most well-known of that series. But for the 1650s, it was illegal for them to make coins. In 1660, England took back that right and realized this gives them a little too much power. The king is really who should be in charge of this. So when Oliver Cromwell, can't say it was dethroned, but lost power and the king was back in the picture, the king decided, no, colonies don't make their own money. We make it and then don't give it to them. That's the way things should work. So Massachusetts decided the solution to this is just keep dating the coins 1652. And unless they actually see you making them, oh, we stopped that back in 1652. And so they made them for about 30 years. They changed the designs. There's some documentation from John Hull, the mint master. Some of his account books and his ledgers, and some of them are still in existence. So we know they were still being made. At one point, Massachusetts actually lost their colonial charter because England figured it out. But that didn't actually stop the coinage. But the coinage did stop at some point.
Is that part of that, the charter oak and all this kind of stuff?
Well, the charter oak is Connecticut.
I understand, but
Right.
They sent a guy
Exactly.
down
Every
here and
colony had a charter which, in essence, like a state constitution.
Yeah.
It basically laid out what powers the king was granting to the local government, what the king was going to provide, basically establishing that colony as a legal entity.
Well, as I understand it, what they were trying to do on the charter oak was they sent a guy down from Boston to pick up our charter so that they could have one big province of New England. And I was wondering if that was the same.
Related in terms of the charters, we're talking about the same documents.
Yeah.
And actually that's a good point because monetarily, it got to the point where a pound in any given colony was not actually worth the same amount as a British pound. The British pound, its value was basically the weight of the value of a given weight of silver. In each of the colonies, since they didn't have British silver and for a variety of other reasons, their accounting currency started to change in value from each other and from England. But they tended to change in groups, not completely in isolation. So the New England states, in general, their currencies were very highly correlated, usually identical over large periods of time. In fact, you see lots of financial documents where someone owes a certain amount of money in the lawful money of New England. And it won't even say a specific colony. It'll just say the lawful money of New England. Now, in the Mid-Atlantic states, from New York down to about Maryland or Delaware, they also acted as a group. Not quite as unified as New England, but their currency was usually worth something different than New England currency, and the southern colonies varied even more, and usually a colony at a time or two, not in a single large group. Well, Massachusetts introducing paper money was one of the things that changed the value of money, and within a decade or decade and a half, all the colonies were issuing paper money. And for a while, that was pretty successful. A lot of it was issued solely as promises to pay. And probably the biggest thing that made it valuable was you could use this to pay your taxes. And so someone knew they could get rid of this paper money to someone who owed taxes, and that person would be able to use it. So even if you weren't sure whether other merchants wanted it, people were willing to take it. There was inflation, but it wasn't really bad most of the time in New England. Another experiment was that some of the currencies were issued by the colony, but they were issued by so-called land banks. And in essence, the government would, instead of just issuing the paper money and spending it for the uses of the government, they would lend it to someone in return for a mortgage on their property. But then when it circulated for a while, the connection between the currency and the mortgage sometimes disappeared, and so the land banks didn't necessarily make the currency that much more stable than currency that didn't have the land behind it. And so that idea, really from the teens or 20s until the 1740s, but then stopped. From about 1720 to about 1750, in New England, paper money worked. It worked in the sense that there was inflation, but it wasn't ridiculous. Money was predictable. After some inflation, they might put out a new issue of paper money. They would then refer to that as new tenor, and the other one as old tenor, so you could specify which issue of money you were talking about, because last year's money was not worth the same as this year's money. It was complicated, but it was working. The British weren't supplying coins very much, although there were some attempts, a mix of public and private. In the 1720s, William Wood from England basically got in good with the king, and the way he did this was by giving the king's mistress 10,000 pounds. Since the king couldn't do it directly because someone would probably trace the money and that would look bad, so he basically bought the right to make money by giving this bribe. He made some money for England, which was so thoroughly despised that Jonathan Swift wrote a nice piece on it, to rile the people up even more against it, although they were already against it. And Charles O'Carolan, who was, I've heard him called the most famous blind itinerant harper of the 18th century, although that, I think, underestimates his importance. He's, I've also heard him compared to Mozart in terms of the quality of some of his music. But because he wrote for the Irish harp, he's not as quite well known. But he wrote one piece called Sir Wood's Lament on the Refusal of His Halfpence. There are no words to it, unfortunately. The tune just makes it clear. It's a very sad lament. So Wood had all these coins that the Irish didn't want. So and there's debate about this, but there are a significant number of people who think that those coins were then exported to America where they were used. They weren't as heavy as British halfpennies, which is part of why people didn't like them. But to make things even worse, Wood had, around the same time, also gotten permission to make a coin specifically for America, so-called Rosa Americana coinage. On one side, there's a picture of the king, and on the other side, a rose and Rosa Americana. Those coins weighed roughly half as much as coins that had the same denomination that were made for England. People figured that out, and they didn't like those very much either. So they didn't really solve the problem very much. And there were other similar attempts that were mostly small, local. There was an attempt, Lord Baltimore had some coinage made for Maryland. Very nice production, relatively small quantities, did not significantly change their economy. This was in the 1690s. So the thought that coins were important and we needed them was going on at the same time that paper money was being invented. Although making coins was hard for a variety of reasons. And one of the local issues, and local with a capital L when I'm in this room, was Samuel Higley's coppers of the 1730s. And his work points up one of the biggest issues with making coins. The main way you made a coin was you make two steel dots. You take two little cylinders of metal, of steel preferably, engrave a design in them, put a blank of copper between them, hit it really hard with a hammer. Well, the reason you have to make the dies of steel is because if you do it with wrought iron, when you hit it with a hammer, those dies are going to shatter. And steel is basically, iron has been modified and alloyed in a way that it changes its properties, and one of the biggest ones is you can harden it without making it brittle. With wrought iron, if you heat it up and you cool it down slowly, it'll be relatively soft, and you can bend it easily. If you heat it up and you while it's hot, you throw it into a bucket of water, it'll be much harder, but it'll be very brittle. And what you need for dies is something that's both hard, so the die doesn't get smushed itself, but not brittle, so it doesn't break. And Higley had figured out how to make steel, and in fact he asked the colonial government in 1728 for permission to have a monopoly on the right to make steel in Connecticut, and was granted that. And so the story of him making coins is as much the story of steel making in the colonies and in Connecticut in particular as it is about copper. I will assume that most of you know a fair amount about the story of copper around here, so I won't go into details, but it was in the first decade of the 1700s, the copper was discovered a few miles from here, and mining started. In fact, the mine that's now Old Newgate Prison, when Samuel Higley was mining in the part of Simsbury that's now East Granby, the Copper Hill mine that's now Old Newgate was owned by Jonathan Belcher, who at the time was governor of Massachusetts. In fact, one of the few people to be governors of multiple states or colonies. After he did his gig in Massachusetts, he went to be governor of New Jersey for a while.
Where they also have copper.
Yes, and in fact, New Jersey was the site of the other really significant copper mine in colonial times, Schuyler mine. And Belcher and Higley had an interesting relationship. Belcher thought everyone was out to cheat him. And so at one point, knowing that Higley was the scientist and the learned man in town, he thought he was being robbed because when he had ore shipped from here to England, people in England said it had like half as much copper in it as he thought it had. So he asked Higley to assay and test some of the copper. When Higley told him that it did have half as much copper as Belcher thought, he claimed Higley was in on it too and wrote him up as a cheat. Even though Higley had no involvement in those business dealings and had no reason to be lying about it. But so even though Higley could make dies, had access to copper, and made coins, it's interesting because of the effort, because of the resources, the social context that it took for this to happen. He didn't do it in isolation. It's not just someone with a copper mine in their backyard who has copper and a hammer. It took a lot more than that. But individual efforts were not going to work. Besides Higley, in 1714, a token was made either for or in Virginia. This is one we know even less about. In fact, this is a token that had been known for 150 years at least, but it wasn't until the 1980s that anyone figured out where it was made. This is a so-called Gloucester token because the first two specimens that were known were each worn out enough and uneven enough they could only read between the two specimens about half the legends, and people could make a bunch of guesses about what it was and where it was from. It wasn't until the discovery of a third specimen in 1981 that they had enough of the legends to figure out it was the Gloucester County Courthouse in Virginia that the little building on the coin was a reference to. But who made it? Was it made locally or was it made for Gloucester? Not only does nobody know, very few people are even willing to speculate very much about that because there's no real information about metalworking in the area. So we're up to, say, the 1730s, 1740s. We have experiments with coins. Paper money at this point can be called much more than an experiment. And credit is really how the economy runs. Running up a tab locally, writing out a note, either if it's a merchant who's not local or a buyer who's not local, or if it's going to be more than a couple of months. But there was trade overseas, and a lot of that trade was with bills of exchange. And bills of exchange basically were a fancy way to deal with book credit when the people who had the credit or the people who had the cash had no interest in doing any business with each other. So if you had someone in Simsbury who was owed some money by someone in London and you wanted to buy something in London, you would buy a bill of exchange from that neighbor, the one who was owed money by someone in London. You would then take that note, ship it to someone in London who you wanted to buy something from, or you owed money to, and that person would then present it to the fourth person who's in London who actually has the cash. And so when I say the fourth person, it was a minimum of 4 people involved. And when bills of exchange were done as printed documents, the convention was not like a checkbook where you write one copy, or even a duplicate one where you save a copy for yourself, but there would be 4 copies of the bill of exchange. And they would be numbered first, second, third, and fourth, and the first one would say, pay this amount as long as none of the other ones have been paid. Because if you ship the first one to London, the odds that it got lost on the way there were high enough that you needed a second copy. And when this system was used by the Continental Congress during the Revolution, what we find is first bills of exchange are virtually unheard of because they were all sent somewhere and either got lost or got processed in some office in Paris or London or Lisbon. Second bills are rare, third bills are a little more common, and fourth bills you find a lot more because it wasn't that common that you needed to send all 4. But the different rarities suggest that it was pretty common to have to send the second or the third one out, that things didn't always get there. And when you look at shipping insurance prices for this period, I'm actually surprised the prices were so low. To ship something to London, the insurance was only about 3 to 5%, depending on where you were shipping it from and what year you were shipping it. But given how you see, like with bills of exchange, the second and third got used a lot, I would have thought a lot more than, say, 1 out of 20 shipments were getting lost. So it may be that paper also got lost for reasons other than just the ship getting lost. This system was complicated, it was slow, but it was what there was. Although silver, 8 reals and 2 and 4 real coins were the most important in terms of coins as part of the economy, the most common coin in America, in British America in the 18th century, were halfpennies, either British halfpence or counterfeit halfpence. The counterfeits were made here, the counterfeits were made in England. Silver and gold was valued by its weight. If you had gold or silver from England or Portugal or Mexico, it didn't really matter. Its value was based on its weight and its fineness. Copper mostly was used at face value within certain limits, and counterfeits weren't even really a big problem, except, I mean, the government cared. There were some times when the penalty for counterfeiting copper was the same as that for counterfeiting silver or gold, which could be as high as death. But in general, the penalties for counterfeiting copper weren't as high, recognizing that it wasn't as big a crime in terms of impact, because there was a lot less profit to be made. And in fact, some people who became fairly prominent were convicted counterfeiters. In Connecticut, someone who I'll be talking about a little bit later, Abel Buell was the first person to make printing type in America. And he did this a decade after the Revolution. But for most of the 18th century, printing type was imported from England or cut out of wood here. He was the first person to make metal printing type in the U.S. He also engraved the dies for Connecticut's own copper coins in the 1780s. He was a sword maker. He did some silverware. He did a lot of things. Very skilled man. He was also a man who had part of one of his ears missing because cropping his ear was the penalty for when he was convicted of counterfeiting in his youth. Although it wasn't that young. And there are some court documents where when cutting off an ear or part of an ear was a possible penalty. Another penalty for counterfeiting was to have a C branded on your forehead. And there's at least one case where the judge is trying to be lenient and saying that C could be sort of small and pretty high up near the hairline, which works for a couple of decades and then it doesn't matter for some of them. Well, in the 1760s, paper money issues increased in part because of the French and Indian War. So did taxes. England was spending a lot of money on the colonies, and Americans were being taxed at a much lower rate than the British. That tax increase was a big chunk of what led to some of the discontent. But it also made some problems with paper money because of the inflation that the larger issues were resulting in. Up until this point, the paper money in the colonies was issued by individual colonies. In 1775, the Continental Congress started issuing what in essence was the first federal paper money. And there are some pieces of it in the back case. And what you'll see is the first issues referred to the United Colonies of America. Even after the Declaration was signed, the paper money still referred to the United Colonies. And they might issue new paper money every 6 months or a year, and the designs would pretty much stay the same. There'd be nice emblems. Since a lot of people were illiterate, they would know that, oh, this design is a $3 bill. And the denominations were interesting choices because the denominations are in dollars, but people are using it to pay debts that are incurred in pounds, shillings, and pence, or trading them for 8 reals. And so there's every denomination you can imagine, and a lot of denominations you probably can't imagine. If Maryland put out a 2 2/3 dollar bill, in continental currency, there was a third of a dollar, a sixth of a dollar, a third of a dollar, half dollar, dollar, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60. And then there was a $70 and an $80 bill. It wasn't issued until the last set of continental currency when inflation was getting pretty rampant. And so an $80 bill seemed like there was a need for it. In the earlier issues, a $20 bill was the highest denomination, and it was also a much larger amount of money. Continental currency is particularly interesting because of the designs. There's a lot of printing technology that you can learn from these. Ben Franklin invented a way to make a printing plate from a leaf. And his logic was it would be so hard to duplicate that design by hand, it would be easy for someone to detect. And it worked pretty well. And he also figured out how to replicate that printing plate. In fact, New Jersey had a single printing plate, well, a single design of a single sage leaf that they made plates of from a master over a couple of decades. And people would recognize it as New Jersey currency, and counterfeits of that, you can actually recognize it's really hard to draw a sage leaf not just that looks realistic, but looks identical to one specific leaf. Continental Currency had used Ben Franklin's leaf designs on the back. Each denomination used a specific leaf. There was also a method to do multicolor printing, have things line up absolutely perfectly. Whereas most two-color printing, you print with one block, then you print with another. There was an invention where basically, like a mortise and tenon joint, you'd have a plate, you take a wooden printing block and cut a rectangular hole in it, then fit a tenon that fits that perfectly, and cut a design on both. Push the piece up, rub some red ink on it, pull it down, rub some black ink on the rest of it, now print with that. The alignment, so you could have the letter R a 1/16 of an inch high, and one half of that letter is in red, one half is in black, and it lines up perfectly. That's a really hard thing to counterfeit, especially if you didn't know how they did it. And if you just knew that the normal way to print two colors is print with one, then print with the other, you would never be successful. And the people who tried that weren't. The two-color ones were counterfeited much less frequently. Besides people counterfeiting just to make money, which is a pretty common incentive, the British also did it as economic warfare. Their idea was that printing counterfeit American paper money would both decrease people's trust in the government, it would also cause inflation and make that money close to worthless. And in fact, there's a newspaper from 1778 from New York. This is when the British had taken over New York. So in essence, this is a British newspaper that has a little classified ad that says, paper money for the price of blank paper. Meet me behind so-and-so's tavern at 2 in the morning. And the particular issue that was in circulation at that point, Congress had to withdraw that from circulation because the British were selling it for the cost of blank paper. And in the back case, you'll see one genuine example of that note and two of the counterfeits. And part of the reason I have two of the counterfeits are more common to this day. And one of the counterfeits is turned over to the back so you can see someone's attempt to make a leaf. It's actually unclear why this was successful counterfeiting because it was really, really obvious that this is the counterfeit. Some counterfeits were higher quality. Besides the British counterfeiting, the large quantity produced questions about whether or not we would win the war, led to inflation, and by the end of the war, continental currency was worth less than 1/2 of 1% of what it had been worth at the beginning. Now, this was in particular a problem to soldiers, because soldiers, not only were they paid in paper, most of them weren't even paid in paper money. They'd be paid a little bit of paper money, and in Connecticut, the system was, you got paid 4 bills. One that was payable a year from now, one that was payable 2 years from now, 1 3 and 1 4. So you're holding this IOU, watching it lose its value day by day. This was a political problem as much as it was an economic problem. And in fact, soldiers who were desperate had to sell them now before they became worth even less. And so some people with capital bought them up, and now that it was people with a lot of capital who weren't representing someone who was owed $10, but someone who was representing a stack of these notes worth $20,000, they had more political power, and they lobbied to have these paid off at above the now face value, arguing in part that the soldiers had fought the revolution for this and they shouldn't be screwed out of their pay, even though the majority of these notes were no longer actually owned by soldiers. Another document you'll see in the back case is, well, actually a pair of documents. One of them is a notice to the sheriff of Hartford County that the tax collector for Enfield for 1786 had not actually turned over the taxes to the state. And the sheriff's help would be greatly appreciated. And at the bottom of that, and this is a printed form, because this situation was not uncommon. And in fact, there are multiple varieties of this form, because they had to reprint it with regularity, apparently. And nothing special about Enfield. This happened in many, many towns. It would be interesting to do some research to figure out how much of this means the tax collector just didn't bother the citizens and didn't collect it, or the tax collector had collected it, but just wasn't really fond of Hartford. But at the bottom of this particular document, there's a note that a certain amount is payable in interest certificates on loans to the state, and the rest would be payable in soldiers' notes, because the tax collector would have been collecting these soldiers' notes, these IOUs that had been depreciated from a bunch of residents. And in 1786, they had lost a big chunk of their value, but some people still had them to whom they had been issued, but there are also other people who had them. I think the images, the legends, say a lot about what people were thinking, and paper money was something people thought about. When you read the newspapers of the 1780s, especially if you read newspapers of 1787 and early 1788, when people are writing letters to the editor, or someone's writing an article about whether or not we should ratify the Constitution or what needs to be in it, there's a significant number that are arguing for or against ratifying the Constitution on the grounds of how it treats paper money. Because people in different states had very different interests, whether it was a state with lots of merchants or more farmers, whether the merchants were dealing with more local trade or seaports were really important in that colony or state. It's interesting how dramatically different it is from now. We can mostly take paper money for granted. And I think one of the biggest things is people didn't take it for granted. They thought about it. Thomas Paine wrote about paper money and the scourge of paper money in his eyes. And so continental currency, which stopped being issued in 1779, was still an issue because it was still out there and getting redeemed at low prices. But there was debates about a national currency. There had been little attempts at coinage. Besides Continental Congress issuing paper money, there was a small issue of so-called continental dollars as coins, based on a Ben Franklin design of 13 links of a chain in a circle to 13 colonies. That had apparently been issued in 1776. I know in 1786 I found a brief article in a newspaper saying the coins issued by Congress in 1776 are now really uncommon. You never see them in circulation. It's time for the government to do something else again. And in fact, shortly after that, in 87, they did. They issued a contract to a group of Connecticut and New York businessmen to make what are now known as the Fugio coppers, because this is a coin that used Ben Franklin's chain design on one side, and on the other side, his sundial design that said Fugio under a sundial, as in, Fugio means I fly, referring to the sundial, so it's time flies. And then below that says mind your business, which probably means something different than those of you chuckling, which probably includes most of us. It doesn't mean mind your business as you mind your business. It's more along the lines of take care of business, pay attention to business. It's more, that's the message that Franklin apparently intended. Although Congress gave the people who were going to make these coins tens of tons of copper, there's actually no evidence that they made more than a couple of tons of copper coins. Well, copper coins with that impression on it. They did take some of the copper and sidetrack it to put a different design on it, a design that they wouldn't have to pay royalties on. And in the 1780s, there was this explosion of copper coins, the size of a British halfpenny, because the British halfpenny was what people knew. Some that copied the designs perfectly but changed the legends to be more American than British. Others that decided to start from scratch and have a brand new design. And the iconography was American. And they had to figure out, what does that mean? The Articles of Confederation gave states the right to make their own money. Connecticut did, Massachusetts did, New York tried, New Jersey did. Connecticut and New York basically copied British halfpennies. Massachusetts had a completely different design, with a Native American on one side and an eagle on the other. New Jersey had a horse head on one side with a plow. Vermont, interestingly, which was not a state at this point, they were an independent republic, their coins show an eye in the center and 14 rays around it with 14 stars between the rays. And the legend is Latin, Stella Quartodecima, the 14th star. Clearly their intention to become the 14th state, was pretty strong. And the other side of those coins was a landscape design of the Green Mountains that is probably among the most beautiful designs of this period and completely non-British.
These are all coins?
These are coins, about the size of a current day quarter, a tiny bit larger, basically substitutes for a British halfpenny. And these were common. Connecticut coppers in particular were made in immense quantities. Not tens of thousands of coins, but hundreds of thousands of coins. They're common enough that people not much older than I am told me of being able to find them for a quarter, 50 cents, or $1. And that says something both about how many they were, how many were made, and something about the history of coin collecting. Coin dealers would often have them in the back in a bin because they didn't really know what they were, and they might have known, but they didn't really care because the customers didn't really care. Too many people wanted things that were shinier, things that were newer, things that hadn't been used, things that all looked the same, but the date was different on them. And that's still a description of the bulk of coin collectors in this country, which is nice for those who like colonial history, because given the relative rarity of some of these things, the prices are incredibly low. That's not to say the prices of all colonial coins are low, but there are coins where only 30 of a given type are known. You can buy for a couple $100. If you find a U.S. silver dollar and there's only 30 of that variety known, you could retire in what you could sell that coin for. That rarity is still supply and demand. How many collectors are there relative? A coin isn't valuable because it's rare, it's valuable because someone wants it. And as long as there are more coins than people who want them, the coin won't be incredibly expensive. Whether that means there's 30 coins or 30,000. I'm not an expert on ancient coins, but I know there are ancient coins you can buy for under $5 that are nice enough you can read every word on the coin. And again, it's supply and demand. And part of it is colonial coins or ancient coins, you need more education and more knowledge to be able to collect them. And a lot of people would like to buy one book for $9 and know as much as they need to know. And I'm not trying to say anything negative about that kind of collecting. That can be a lot of fun. But the thing that got me to be a collector of any of this is the connection to history. I mean, as a kid, I put pennies in the blue board with the different dates like a lot of people did. But when I got to the 18th century, I found it was much more connected to people's lives because money was not something you took for granted in the 19th century. I promised to get up to the point of the U.S. Mint. And in the 1780s, as we're talking about the Constitution, people in the government are also talking about making federal money again and making it in a significant way. At one point when Robert Morris was in charge of the Treasury, but it was actually his assistant, Gouverneur Morris, who interestingly was not related to him, who came up with a proposal that he thought it would please everyone. And least common denominator is probably the best way to describe this. He wanted to find a unit of money that you could easily divide or multiply into every other possible money that people cared about. So it had to be divisible by 8 because of the 8 reals. It had to go into 20 because of 20 shillings. It had to be divisible by 12 because of pence and shillings. So he came up with a dollar that instead of 100 cents had 1,440 sub-units. and I have a very strong suspicion that that's exactly the response he got when he presented this. I know that Thomas Jefferson must have laughed at him, given the way he wrote about it. He basically said, this is about as unfamiliar a number as you could impose on people as possible. The idea that it works into everything and you never have to have fractions doesn't actually make it any better in this case. And the argument came down to what we are using now. A dollar, well, the official system, if you look at our laws, is the dollar is the basic unit. And there are divisions of a quarter, or a tenth, or a 20th, so quarter, dime, and nickel, and then the 100th as a cent. And for accounting, the mill, 1/1000th of a dollar. And given what a dollar was worth in the 1780s, that made a lot of sense. They never made coins smaller than 1/2 cent, but accounting for some purposes was done in mills. But it also specifies units of currency higher than the dollar. The eagle is $10, and a double eagle is $20. And those were chosen to correspond to, fairly close to, British gold coins. So again, there was an attempt to make things easy, since they knew this was not going to be the global currency, because it's not as if the U.S. was going to be a superpower or something like that. So the dollar was just for our use, but we had to be able to exchange it easily with other currencies. That won out, but it didn't happen immediately. Even into the 1790s, there's some documents where things are written as not dollars and cents, but dollars and 90ths. And again, I'm glad we don't use that one very much. So the U.S. Mint is organized in 1792 in Philadelphia. And the first thing they do is make half cents and what people now know as large cents. Large cents because the idea was that cents had to have a penny's worth of copper in them. And that made them about the size of the British halfpenny, that is a little larger than what we now know as a quarter. And that was the size of the U.S. cent up until 1857. And 1857 is also the time up until which many, many foreign coins were legal tender in the U.S. Because it wasn't until 1857 that the mint, the government basically was confident the U.S. Mint could produce enough coinage to satisfy the need for commerce in the U.S. And so in the 1790s, we had mint, we had coins. 93, they're making half cents and cents. 1794, they start making silver for circulation. There were trials in 1792. In fact, a half dime in 1792 has on one side a bust of a female head said by some to be Martha Washington. I strongly suspect that that's not said by people who either knew her or liked her. And you will see the coin. I show some slides right briefly after this. It's also said that the silver made for those trials came from some of George and Martha Washington's silverware. Again, it'd be great to find documentation that's true. Yes?
How's that pronounced? Is it half dime or half
I've heard
dime?
half dime and half deem. But I haven't heard anyone explain it. It's with enough logic. There is an S in it.
Silent S, is that?
But it's, I haven't heard anyone explain it in a way that convinces me that one is correct and the other one is incorrect. One of them may be correct, but it's unclear to me how people in 1792 would have pronounced it.
Basically half dime.
I call it a half dime because if I'm not sure, it just feels weird to say a half beam.
Right.
Because then you have to explain what you're talking about.
I never knew how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
I've seen it there. Nobody's ever pronounced it. So
Yeah,
I-
I've heard both.
There's nobody
I've also
around
heard
now
someone say it with the S,
Pronounce
and and I asked them why they pronounced the S. Their explanation was even less convincing. Doesn't mean they're wrong. It just sounded like they thought, well, there's an S, so you must say it.
Well, good, now I don't feel bad if I say it that way, and nobody knows how it's said, so I'm okay.
Right. I mean, there
Yeah, what
might
I
be
say.
someone. Yeah. And so coinage was local, it became important, and the most important thing is it became federal and reliable, but not reliable in quantity. Banks, as we know them, were starting to come about in the 1780s, but even by the War of 1812, there were only 2 or 3 dozen banks in the U.S. Connecticut had 2 banks, one in Hartford, one in New Haven, both founded in 1792. And so merchants and accounting was still important. When banks became more common, they also became less reliable. Banknotes got counterfeited. Best way to spend a counterfeit banknote was spend it at least 30 miles away from the bank. And people didn't know the bank had been out of business for 6 months. That happened a lot. I have a letter from 1811, which I'm lucky enough to have with an $8 bill that it refers to, and it says, "Thank you so much for paying your bills on time. The next time you owe me money, I'd really appreciate it if you pay me counterfeit." It's a great letter, and the fact that it has what appears to be the right counterfeit with it was a nice find. But, you know, well into the 19th century, money was still not taken for granted. A single federal paper currency was not something we had until after the Civil War, and it wasn't until 1929 that federal paper money without banks being involved was really the only paper money. So it took a long time to get to what we now pretty much take for granted. I realize it's been a little bit of a whirlwind. I mean, I hope sort of conveyed to you how much history there is, how many interesting things there are, how many different directions you can go with this, whether your interest is local money, what people spent in Simsbury in different decades, or what paper money looks like, and what designs people would choose to put on their paper money at different times, or the technology of how it's made. There's lots of different ways to look at it. Some of them people have done in great detail, some people have barely scratched the surface. I'm going to run through a quick slideshow of some of the things that I've been talking about. And again, if anyone has any questions, please, since I have my back to you, feel free to just talk up or ask a question. Don't.
I've heard or read that iron bars of different lengths or weights were used as a means of exchange or currency. Is that true?
They have been in some places and times. I don't know that that was ever common in the colonies. If so, the most likely situation would have been in cases where they were ballast on one leg of a journey. This is some wampum, quahog shells, or sometimes cowries and others, but I think quahog shells really were the most common. This is a sixpence of the Lord Baltimore silver issue. So now these were made in England for Maryland. They were not made here. Now this is the inside of a book from 1779 where someone, David Mallory, his book, bought in 1779. The price was $5 bushels of corn. The price of corn was 12 shillings per bushel in silver currency, but he bought the book in corn. This is a photocopy of, this is a printed image of the 1690 issues of Massachusetts paper money. It's not a drawing of one, it's actually a photograph of one, but it's sort of been made into black and white, so you don't really see what the paper looks like. But this is it. Like all the paper money of this era, it was signed by hand. If you look at the paper money we have now, it's signed in the printing plate. So 3 guys sat down and signed each one of these notes. And so if you were going to make a counterfeit, you had to get 3 different signatures, hopefully similar to the official ones.
Even in the Civil War.
Yeah. Now the top of the note is wavy, because when it says this indented bill, indented is it was cut out from the sheet, and basically the stub was retained. And this is another one. This is a quarter of a note, and sometimes they circulate it as a quarter of a bill. This is Connecticut, I believe 1724. But so that curly Q design at the top, some government official has the stub
To identify it.
right, and so they could compare it to that if you had one. This is the back of that quarter. This is a half bill. Willie's Pitkin. If you're familiar with a lot of Connecticut history, some of the names of 6 signers, we're familiar, this is the back of that note. This is a genuine British halfpenny of George II from the 1720s. This is so-called proof. It was struck twice on a polished planchet, really aimed for a collector, not to be spent. A circulating one will look the same, but this one, this is copper, and this is about 1 millimeter larger than a U.S. quarter. And this is the basic design. Now, George II ones would face to the left. George III, they then faced right. This is another specimen. I'm trying to figure out if this one's real or counterfeit. I think this one is genuine.
I've got a question for you now.
Yes.
For the size of those coppers and for the years, let's say King George II's, let's say you get one from around 1730s. Weight-wise, how did that compare to a Higley?
Pretty similar.
Okay, now this is a half pence. What gave Higley the audacity to put the value of 3 pence on his?
I think audacity is a pretty good word. Yeah.
I heard it was the price of a drink.
Although I don't know if
back
that's
then.
worth it.
He loved to throw them on the counter at the taverns. For the
You know,
price of a drink.
we hear that as a legend, but there's no evidence for that one. Now this is a counterfeit. Probably a cast copy of a George II. But they were also made as struck copies. This one says 1776, and given that the British didn't make them in 1776, it's an easy way to tell that it was a counterfeit. This is one of William Wood's coins. Again, besides the 10,000-pound bribe to his mistress, you put the king's face on it if he's going to let you make coins. And this is the Rose Americana from 1723. Sweet and useful. Yeah. This is the Gloucester token, one of the best of the 3 known. So presumably an attempt to be a shilling, since it says 12. And this one says Dawson, and there was a Richard Dawson from that area. But again, this is the best of the 3 known. Virginia. This is one of Higley's coppers. I cut my way through. It is often thought to be one of the later issues. People would, I think more by logic than anything else, assume that the ones that say the value of 3 pence were the first ones, and then if he met some objections, try to get creative. So if I cut my way through, or value me as you please, then there's, well, this is, okay, so this is not word. This is a value of 3 pence. Also, I am good copper. Now, there are 3 in terms of dates, there are three classes of booklets. There are 16 or 17 varieties known. Some say 1737, and there's pretty strong evidence, including probate records, that he died in May of 1737. There are also some undated ones, which, if you use the logic of what the legends say, were probably struck after 37. And then there are some that are dated 1739. They were struck by hand. If you look on the right, the word please looks all mashed up because the design didn't come out perfectly, so he hit it again, took the hammer out again. Probably at least half of Hickley's coppers are noticeably struck more than once. Sometimes it improved it, sometimes it didn't. So this again, I am good copper. This is the society specimen, which is in the back case, one of the society specimens. Again, in the word copper, especially in the letter E and R, you can see the double stripe. So the die shifted a little bit. Yeah, the last PER on all those, you can see it. Now, this is from an almanac of 1771. It's how much are coins worth? The column to the left is how much are they worth in British sterling silver. So a guinea is worth £1, 1 shilling. Spanish pistorenes, dollars and pistoles. Portugal, from Portugal, Mador, and what would have been called half Joe, and above that a Joe. Then French coins, and there is a French crown or écu in the back case. The Louis d'Or was basically what was referred to sometimes as a French guinea, but guinea was officially the French name. So then the second column is how much it's worth in New York. The third column, third and fourth column I can't read well from here. Let me go back. The fourth column is Philadelphia and Quebec. And the last column is what's the least weight that that coin should have to be worth face value. And so this was a New York almanac, and like I said, at a meeting of the Chamber of Commerce, it was resolved that members of that corporation would receive half Joes at sort of an official value. And lots of almanacs had tables like this. I have a coin scale from the 1780s or 1790s, scale probably from the 1780s, that has one of these taped inside the lid. Because if you were weighing coins, seeing if they were real, you'd need this all the time. When the U.S. got loans from France to pay for the revolution, part of what they used that money for was to pay the interest on debt they already had. So someone would have been given this, like a bill of exchange. You see this third bill, the first, second, and fourth not paid. So this was the third bill of exchange for a set of four to someone who was owed $24. $24 was the interest they were owed on a larger bond. The nice thing is, in the lower left, you see to the commissioner or commissioners of the United States of America at Paris. So the U.S. owes you 24 bucks, and yeah, you can collect it in Paris. So this would have to be sent to Paris to get your money, because that's where the money was. They didn't send the money to the U.S. They kept it in Paris when they loaned it to us. And each state was responsible for raising money by borrowing it or other ways. And so there was a Continental Loan Office. And the bottom was the commissioner of the Continental Loan Office in the state of Maryland, because the signature on the right is Francis Hopkinson, the federal treasurer of loans, and on the left with his signature of, in this case, Thomas Howard, the commissioner of the Maryland State Office. So there are issues like this for each of the states. This is right. It was printed in 1778 or 9, and this particular one was issued in 1780. You see in the upper right.
You mean that the money was kept in Paris?
When France said they would lend us money, they didn't actually send the money to the U.S. They said, yeah, you can let people come and get it. $24 at a time. Now, this is a picture of a bond, one of those loans from Massachusetts, to pay their share of the war effort. This one, the actual bond is in the back page if you want to take a look at it. It's interesting because it's effectively the first inflation indexed bond, which is, inflation index bonds are now a fairly common thing on Wall Street. They haven't always been that way. But because there were not well-established price indexes like the Consumer Price Index or anything you can read in the Wall Street Journal now, this one, below the part where it's filled in, the next line says both principal and interest to be paid in the then current money of said state in a greater or lesser sum according as follows. 5 bushels of corn, 68 pounds, blah, 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 of beef, 10 pounds of sheep's wool. So it's basically not, I owe you $110. It's, I owe you the amount of money that what's now worth $110 in these items, whatever those items were worth in 5 years, you owe me that amount. They had no clue what the currency would be worth, other than that it probably wouldn't be worth what they wanted. So they basically created a price index. They didn't just base it on beef, they based it on a half dozen things. So there was some balance. Now, Massachusetts issued some bonds. Some bonds were because you actually loaned money to the state. Other loans, loan is a looser word. So like if you bought a lottery ticket and you won, you didn't get money. You got a bond saying they would give you money eventually. If the government came and took your horse and said we need it for the war, they didn't pay you for the horse, they gave you a bond. Now, this is a piece of paper money from Connecticut, and you didn't just go to the bank and say, this one's torn, give me a new one. You took out needle and thread and you sewed it. Before you sewed it, well, actually, they didn't always sew it. Sometimes you took a pin and you put it together, but not everyone had a pin. Before you sewed it, first you took a newspaper and glued it to the back of the hook. That would work, but since it didn't work, you had to sew it. This is Timothy Green, who was a well-known printer, did books and other things, also printed the majority of Connecticut's paper money. Whereas some states and colonies changed the design every time, Timothy Green printed most of our paper money here and printed most of it in the very same style. The details would change, but it was still ornate engraved borders, or woodcut borders, but not dramatically different from time to time. So this is a note of 1770. The slash means it's been canceled. That is, at some point the government redeemed it. One of the interesting things you'll notice about this if you read it is this is worth 5 shillings with interest at 2.5% per year. Part of the way you convinced people to take paper money was to pay them. So it's more like a bond in the sense that it earns interest, but this was ordinary paper money. And again, 3 signatures. Another note you see, oh, actually, sorry, that's that same note. Again, the details don't differ. You see the state seal in the lower left, and then just ornate borders. The 3 grapevines. The hand above it, which you also see on Higley's coppers, that pointing hand. Back. I'll just run through a few examples of. Oh, this one's interesting. This is a 3-pence note. In 1777, trying to deal with small change issue. Besides larger pieces of paper money, they issued some small ones. They're about 1.5 inches by 1.75 inches, only printed on one side. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 and 7 pence. And again, someone still signed every note. They numbered them. The big hole in this one is like the slash. It was paid. So this is no longer money. Both Connecticut paper money and financial documents such as this next one. This is an interest certificate. You didn't have to go to Paris to collect, but saying that you're owed this amount of money for interest on the debt in 1790. The slash through this one both means it's canceled and means it's almost definitely has its provenance in a dumpster that was outside the Connecticut State Library with the State Archives sometime in the 60s. when the state archives decided, we have like dozens of boxes of this stuff. We should keep like one or two of each if we want to do a museum exhibit and dump it. And a couple of either, and I've never figured out if it was people who were very lucky, very smart, or very crooked, knew about that dumpster, and have been selling this stuff for the past 35 years. And sometimes, I think the original owners do not own it anymore. So I don't think there's anyone who has 1,000 of these. But there are 1,000 of some of those.
Do we know who was Ralph?
Yeah, Ralph Pomeroy was the state comptroller in 1790. Some were also signed by Oliver Wolcott Jr., who ended up being, I think, on the state Supreme Court later. This is the counterfeit on the right. The one on the left is a little bit more worn, and you see those leaves. But even though it's more worn, you can sort of tell the one on the right doesn't really look like it was printed from a leaf. It's got this cross-hatching that looks like it was done by hand, and it was. This is one of the so-called soldier notes I referred to. In the middle, it says, being 1/4 part of the balance due to him, which shall be paid out to him or on his order in gold or silver. 1/4 part being crossed off says 1/2 part, probably because he wasn't owed that much, they're just going to give him 2 notes. This was issued in 1782, but not payable right away. Payable 1789, up until 1789. The upper left is a pound sign, and then it says 9 pounds, then the colon, so then 9 pounds, 9 shillings, and 0 pence. So that's the amount in the upper left. And like paper money, the left side is so-called indented. So they, someone had a fake one, they can compare it to the stub book. This is basically a receipt where pistols are not guns, but they are those Portuguese coins. So someone sold 8.5 of them at 16 shillings and 11 pence each, and one ditto lightly. So one of the coins wasn't worth 16.11, it was only worth 16.1. And then there was a commission for getting it to New York. And then, so he sent me these coins, given how much they weigh, this is what they're worth, I take my commission for getting them to London, then net proceeds to his account, 7 pounds, 18 shillings, 3.5 pence. So the merchant is in New York, and at the bottom you see this is to a London merchant. So someone was paid 1 shilling, 7 pence to get this coin to London. This is, when I mentioned some of the 2-color paper money, on the left-hand side you see the black and the red lined up. This is a piece of paper money, $55 bill, with light shining through it because there was a watermark that paper money made specifically for this issue of paper money in 1779. It says Confederation. So not basically, when you make paper, you're going to take the pulp and lay it out on a mesh surface. Instead of that mesh being perfectly smooth, you can have it have some texture. So then when you press things against it, certain parts are probably infinitesimally thinner. But it also means you had to have more skill. Making watermark paper is challenging. This is one of the Continental dollars of 1776, and again with the Fugio and Mind Your Business design on the front, and the 13 links for each one, and American Congress, we are one in the middle.
Is that tin?
They're tin or pewter. I have not seen anyone actually analyze the metal.
Wouldn't you do a mass spectrometry on all coppers and stuff?
I've analyzed some of the coppers. I've not had a chance to borrow any of these to analyze them. I would love to do that. My academic background was, I used to be a biologist, and so I'm sort of familiar with a lot of lab work. And working at a university, I have found different ways to analyze coins. we used to have a nuclear reactor, and there were methods I could use using a reactor. Federal government decided they didn't want to pay for as many reactors, and ours happened to be one that shut down. But there are some electron microscopes that basically shoot X-rays at a coin, and from the radiation that bounces off, you can tell what element it's bouncing off of. And I've done that to some copper coins to see what else it's got in it. So this is the Fujio copper, quarter size, but again, based on Franklin's design. And yeah, the continental dollars would be very nice to analyze because we also see there's different batches of them. Different batches, different die varieties, the metal looks very different. I suspect that like the ones that are really shiny and the ones that look very tinny probably are different metals. This is a counterfeit half penny. And again, to a casual observer, it looks pretty good. But the date isn't. England wasn't making them at this point. This is a Connecticut coin. So again, the basic design of the British, but instead of Georgia's 2 Rex or 3 Rex, it says Auctori Connect. Basically, an abbreviation of an attempt in Latin to say by the authority of Connecticut. This is an interesting variety because the dies were very good in the sense that they were hard enough, but they lasted very, very long. This is one of the most common colonial coins or Confederation era coins there are. But that horn sticking out of his shoulder is where the die started chipping away. And it didn't chip away all at once. So there are coins where the horn doesn't exist. There are coins where it's a dot at the tip of what's now the horn. Then it grows. You could probably find like 15 or 20 sort of different lengths of that. That it seemed like it chipped away a little bit every once in a while. Whereas there's some dies that break catastrophically. And
They still kept using the die.
oh yeah, making the die was hard enough, you kept using it until it really broke. Now the reverse, instead of saying Britannia, which you definitely didn't want, they used, again, an attempt at Latin to abbreviate independence and liberty. So INDE, and the other side is ET, and then space LIB. This one just happens to be a little bit off-center. Again, the heads don't always look perfect. There's some that have gotten nicknames. The other one's called the Horn Bust. This one, I don't know if this one has a nickname, although if it doesn't, I can't imagine why not.
Is that not a counterfeit?
Well, it's a Connecticut copper, and I believe it's counterfeit in the sense that it's not one of the ones made under the contract. Some of the things that say Auctori Connect were made with some of the copper intended for the Fujios, or I mean with other coppers. Some of them were made here, West Point, New York, by a place called Machen's Mills. Thomas Machen was an engineer who actually was the person who made the chain link, a chain across the Hudson River to stop the British from getting too far north. The links were like 2.5 or 3 feet across. And if you took every link that someone claims is from that chain, the link that chain could have crossed the river about 6 times. There may be some that are real, but there are many people who claim to have a link from Machen's chain. This, I believe you're right, I think maybe one of the ones made there. A couple of different places made these. And this one they just split the left and right. Thomas Machen, M-A-C-H-I-N, was his name. This is one from dies made by Abel Buell. Besides engraving a lot of dies, and some counterfeit paper when he was younger, he also figured out really sort of some of the early real Industrial Revolution aspects of coinage. The head punch was not cut separately into each die. He made a punch, and then he could make multiple dies with it. And then he even had a master punch that included the words. His coins, one quick sentence, they differ in the punctuation before and after the words. There's like 47 varieties just of punctuation. And people have wondered, was there a code, like this is January's work, or made on a Tuesday, or was it just random? It's hard to imagine it's random, but no one has ever deciphered it if it is code. Was there a question behind it?
Yes. It's a two-part question.
were there very many counterfeit coins made? And then secondly, were the counterfeit coins counterfeited in the sense that they used inferior metals?
Well, the coppers, there was a lot of counterfeiting. There were often real coppers, sometimes underweight, but you didn't save that much money there wasn't much cheaper than copper that looked halfway decent. So people counterfeiting coppers mainly use copper, but just would use lightweight. People counterfeiting silver coins or gold coins very frequently use stuff that wasn't up to snuff, because that's where they can save money. Here's another one where on the left you can see above the letter C, the die is starting to crack. The colon on the right, the crack is also coming through that. And the back of that coin, that die was cracking too. To the right, from the figure to the right, you see a crack in the needle. And the date, looks like there's stuff going on there. This was a die that was old and worn out when this coin was made. New York tried to make coins, a bunch of different people. None of them really made things in large quantities. This, people speculate this is George Washington. Some said George Clinton, although Washington seems like it might be more likely. The Latin translates not by force, but by virtue of George Contrary. Yep. And so many people have said this was Washington. And Neo-Equinorensis is, I guess, the best they can come up with as a way to say New York in Latin. Right. And again, not the best, but it basically, is literal. And this is one of the Vermont coins of 1786. A number of the coins I'm showing you, not all of them, but many of them belong to Notre Dame. Notre Dame University had a decent coin collection, and then twice in the past 20 or 30 years, people have given significant collections to them, and one of them was kind enough to also endow the collection. And then around the same time, the person who's a rare book librarian of University is also a numismatist. Now, his PhD is in medieval history, but he likes this stuff. He grew up in Massachusetts, so he knew some of the history, and he's really taken on their coin collection, put a lot of it on the web. And there's a sheet of references on the back counter, and I think there's a link to their website on this. And if anyone has specific questions about certain areas, I can also give you ideas of other sources for more information.
What does that say?
Vermontentium Res Public. So, Republic of Vermont. And they debated how to abbreviate. So there is one say Vermontentium, one say Vermont. And it's Stella Quartodecima. And this is basically based on a 1783 design for federal coinage that just had 13, and the legend said Nova Constellatio, the new constellation. So they were using what was a somewhat familiar design already. This is one of the Mason's Mills copies. This head design is real distinctive. It's both clearly not genuine and only seen on coins that, for other reasons, whether it's the punches used for the letters or other things, clearly made at Mason.